of this presentation will discuss the part of whether sex workers are victims of gender-sex inequality, which is a system of male power. This will be discussed through a critical debate between radical and liberal feminist perspectives, followed by an analysis of socialist feminism. The second part will discuss the term embodied in the law, looking at prostitution laws in various different legal systems.
Radical feminists compare the act of prostitution to the act of human trafficking to display the great physical and social abuse these female slaves are put through by men and our society respectively. This is the recruitment of women to be stripped of their mind, body and rights. Prostituted women are slaves to our patriarchal society, which allows a male domination over the lives and rights of all women. This is gender socialisation, whereby society serves men by objectifying and subordinating women.
Like McKinnon, we believe this submission to men is how women develop an internalised oppression that reduces them to a product designed for sexual abuse. The oppressive nature of society towards women is in all aspects of life, but this type of female slavery is the most explicit form of gender inequality. Former prostitute Judy Halfon states, "I see that wanting men to want you is exactly what men want."
Liberal feminists would argue that any sex inequality is not a consequence of society, but in fact it is the other way round. Society and its attitudes create a stigma which results in the appearance of a male-dominated, gender-unequal society. This stigma comes from moralistic views about female sexuality and roles stemming from puritanical or conservative group attitudes. These groups remain in the 21st century invested in gender hierarchy by viewing female sexuality as legitimately controlled by men. In this view, sex workers are seen as a grave threat to this control, but this control is theory and the theory is outdated to say the least. This attitude demeans women even further by suggesting that they are somehow unaware of oppression. The idea of women as slaves reasserts the patriarchal society more than the act of prostitution itself.
Radicalists state that the gender domination is so pervasive that women's agency and autonomy is denied. These women are slaves through the exploitation, abuse and misery that is intrinsic to the sex trade. This abuse of the vulnerable is practiced through coercion and threats. Women have no choice, they are being raped. This is the unfortunate result of our oppressive society that strips women of the ability to make civil agreements. We should stop defining prostitution as a victimless crime and acknowledge it for what it is, a crime committed against women by men.
On the contrary, many sex workers would argue that their work is consensual and as the result of a contractual agreement. Therefore, how can it be argued that these women are victims? It is the social stigma surrounding sex work which is oppressive rather than the work itself, and it is these structures which lead sex workers into danger. Radical feminists, by denying women's agency, are contributing to rather than fighting against patriarchal frameworks.
Radicals rebut this as it is a myth that prostitutes have property in their person, which is a view that captures the sole focus of radical feminism. This view is reported by McKinnon, who states that what is actually being sold in sex is slavery opposed to free wage labour.
Liberal feminism takes the view that sex work should be recognised as a form of employment. Martha Nussbaum summarises the validity of sex work as a job by comparing it to other jobs which require bodily service, such as a masseuse using her hands for her client's pleasure, but rightly argues that the main difference is the stigma attached to sex work. This stigma then is what creates sex and gender inequality, or rather the appearance of it. Sex workers are not victims of sex and gender inequality, but of the false, radical stereotype that society has formed.
In contrast, radicals believe prostitution cannot be viewed as an equal exchange but the culmination of long-term sex inequality. Rachel Moran describes this as, "The nature of sex is mutuality, and where you don't have mutuality, you have sexual abuse."
This radical view that women are unable to choose and are subjects to male dominance in itself enforces false stereotypes of the inferior woman. The sex and gender inequality is found in the presumption of no choice, the idea that women need to be saved, and cemented in debilitating, undermining language such as victim. Making the decision to be a sex worker and sell sex as labour, a separate entity to the worker's self or emotions, is in itself power. Choosing to utilise their own physical capabilities for their own economic benefit is the ultimate form of self-reliance and autonomy.
Liberal feminists argue that these women have made a choice, but radicalists argue that it is likely to be physical and social abuse of the oppression in earlier life from childhood sexual abuse. These women have already been reduced to a state of no rights and have learned to disregard the meanings of consent.
Radical feminist perspectives are understandable given the history of prostitution. However, the perspective is outdated. The approach overlooks changes to the general positioning of women in society over time. Legislation and social discussion, undoubtedly influenced by radical feminism, have often blurred or denied any difference between trafficking and prostitution, and this has always made things worse rather than better for those involved. Nadine Strossen has suggested that to insist no woman in society could freely consent to participate in sex work shows the same disregard for women's autonomy as previous courts did when ruling that a woman's non-consent to sex did not mean she had been raped.
With regard to the male system of power for radicals, society's objective ideal is created and dominated by men, and the liberal state does not protect the interests of women.
Society adheres to its own ideal of fairness, which liberal feminists wrongly state has changed. The system of male power is one of historic nature that exists still because objectivity is the norm. This objectivity is the reasonable man. This is the white British male. Where do women fit? They don't.
I will now move on to and analyse the socialist feminist perspective as an alternative, more valid way of explaining sex work. The central concepts of socialist feminism are that of capitalism and patriarchy, and through this, Hallstrom looks at worker organisation and alienation. So while it has some similarities to radical feminist perspectives, it doesn't look at gender inequality as the sole or only explanation. Socialist feminists, like liberal ones, refer to prostitution as sex work. The main reason behind this is central to their theory. To quote Hallstrom, they feel that by calling prostitution sex work is an attempt to remove it from sexual moralising, thereby opening up possibilities for prostitutes to organise for rights as workers. Socialist feminists argue that sex work must be seen as a legitimate form of work. That way we can organise labour rights. It is, however, important to acknowledge and quote Katie Cruz in saying that supporting sex worker struggles within the labour process need not mean that sex work or any form of wage labour be celebrated. Ideally, socialist feminists would like an overthrow of the whole capitalist structure. Therefore, by referring to sex work as prostitution, radical feminists are sexually moralising sex workers, thereby decreasing their chances of implementation of their working rights and therefore worsening their situations. Socialist feminists do not take a stance as extreme as that of radical and liberal feminists, in saying that choice for sex work is either complete, full, or non-existent. This is too simplistic. Instead, it argues that women's choice can be limited or socially constrained, and that ultimately, sex workers can be both oppressed and empowered. They describe choice as merely picking between the lesser of two evils. In this sense, the socialist theory can help with the shortcomings of the other two explanations of choice in sex work, because it takes into account the whole social and economic context of a decision-making process. Furthermore, socialist feminists would argue that the law is shaped by the capitalist society that we live in.
Radical feminism is embodied in the law. In the UK, the selling of sex itself is legal, but it is illegal to solicit in a public place for the purposes of offering a prostitute under Section 16 of the Policing and Crime Act 2009. The Sexual Offences Act 2003 also attempts to prevent the trafficking of women or inciting prostitution for gain. Whilst on paper this may seem reasonable, radical feminists believe criminalisation worsens the situation, as the law is not neutral and the rights of women are not protected.
Believing that criminalisation of sex work increases the chances of rights violations against women, driving an already fragile industry underground, liberal feminists argue that legalisation of the sex trade would lead to safer workplaces and enable more women to feel safe, bringing it in line with other trades. The Swedish model demonstrates how following a radical feminist approach can be problematic. In Sweden, it is illegal to buy sex of any kind, however not illegal to sell. This stigmatises and alienates sex workers, suggesting that adult women cannot form valid consent about sex. A study by Canadian authorities comparing various legal frameworks regarding sex work found that this leads sex workers to feel isolated and more apprehensive about approaching authorities when they do face difficult customers.
Women are not victims, but are simply empowered using their property of the person as labour, but due to the legal position in the UK and USA, are subject to demeaning attitudes. The law in New Zealand, for example, does not fuel this stigma. Sex work is a fully legal trade and women are free and equal to choose to work within it, supporting key liberal ideas. The Prostitution Law Review Committee in New Zealand in 2008 reported no notable expansion of the trade, but more women were willing to come forward to report crimes committed against them. What remains then is deep-rooted societal attitudes. Legalisation supports the liberal idea of individual rights and instills a sense of dignity and self-respect to challenge the stigma of sex work. This approach would address the shortcomings of the radicalist approach that is unfortunately embodied in the UK